Good morning, PT on Ice crew. My name is Dustin Jones. I am a faculty member with the Institute of Clinical Excellence in the Older Adult Division. I teach modern management of the older adult with Christina Previtt. We had our week 6 wrap up last night, which is while we're speeding through this course. It seems like a very fast pace. These weeks just go by very, very quickly. But we had an awesome discussion last night where we talked about cognitive decline, we talked about loaded carries, we talked about communication, cueing, feedback, all these different topics. But one thing that came up was death and dying, and I figured I'd talk about it this morning. This is obviously a difficult topic to address. It's a difficult topic for me to talk about, just because I'm a 32-year-old physical therapist, about to have my first kid, just kind of, relatively in a good stage of life. And I want to realize and acknowledge how naive I am to this topic, how I've not lived long enough to experience some of the hardships that many of you all have faced that listen to this podcast or others. So I know my perspective on death and dying is very limited, but I do just want to talk about this stuff on this platform because I feel like we do need to address some of these harder subjects ourselves, but then also, be able to talk about that with our patients and ultimately, provide a better experience and service to the people that we serve, which is our patients. Right after this, I'm going to be going to a funeral back home in West Virginia. So this has just kind of been on my mind. So we'll do our best today, but I just wanted to give kind of a little bit of perspective for a lot of you all that may be you may be working with some older adults, but that may not be the majority of your patient population. Let's say you're in a nice little outpatient clinic where you've got a diverse group of people. You got your high school athletes that you see, you got your weekend warriors, and then you may have, some of those older adults or Medicare patients, as some like to call them, that are filling those midday slots. I just want you to think about some of the life transitions that they may be experiencing. Think about some of your patients that have had long careers in a specific type of trade that are now not able to do that job anymore. They may have transitioned into some form of retirement where they are not able to do or not choosing to do what they used to do before. Some of your patients may have started to lose some of their best friends, some of their family due to some type of illness, or some people just lived a long life and have passed away. That is something that's literally staring at a lot of our patients right in the face that they have to confront with. Some of our patients have lost their spouse, for example, which is a very, very tragic thing to go through. But a lot of life transitions can happen in what we would term the older adult stage of life, kind of beyond 65. And we need to acknowledge the questions that brings up. A lot of us, maybe in our late 20s, 30s, 40s, we may not necessarily think about the implications of some of those transitions, but we have to acknowledge it. It really brings up the questions of, what is life about? What am I going to do now? What's the point of all this? That are very, very deep questions that our patients are grappling with. And the better I feel that we can understand those situations and understand what they're facing, the better off we'll be, when we reach that point, down the road. But we'll better be able to serve them in a very helpful way and have some type of empathy to understand what they're going through. So I want to just kind of give a brief history of death and dying in our kind of American context, because I find it pretty interesting. So you all have heard of the 5 stages of grief. So DABDA, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. So that was coined by a Swiss-born psychiatrist, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She first introduced this concept in a book called On Death and Dying, which was published in 1969. I haven't read this book, but a lot of people that I really look up to have read it and said it's an amazing read. But it basically stemmed from her seeing the huge contrast in how her homeland of Switzerland views and treats death and dying compared to the U.S. So, back at home in Switzerland, it was normal. People accepted that they are going to die. They talked about it. It was a part of their life. They knew you're born into this world and you're going to leave this world. And it wasn't this taboo subject that people kind of tiptoed around, but they talked about it. They brought it to the table. as compared to the U.S., especially, when, she was doing this work in the late 60s. Death was not talked about. A lot of older adults are being institutionalized, pushed away, you just kind of into the fringes of society, and we were ignoring aging, we were ignoring death. And she is one that really brought light to this issue. And I want to read what her testimony was, because in 1972, she testified at the first national hearing on the subject of death with dignity, which was conducted by the U.S. Senate Special Committee on Aging. I'm just going to read this to you verbatim. So Kubler-Ross states, "We live in a very particular death-denying society. We isolate both the dying and the old, and it serves a purpose. They are reminders of our own mortality. We should not institutionalize people. We can give families more help with home care and visiting nurses, giving the families and the patients the spiritual, emotional, and financial help in order to facilitate the final care at home." Now, if you hear that quote, one of the first things that may come to mind for many of you is, oh, well, she's talking about hospice and palliative care. But at that moment, that wasn't a thing. Hospice was not on anyone's radar, and she was really a pioneer in getting that to become an actual service that we provide. I mean, there's many other people that were in kind of that hospice movement for sure, but I do want to highlight her work and really bring to light, how are we caring for people that are on their deathbed, they're actively dying, because it was not a very, very good system before, kind of hospice and palliative care came around. And so that was that kind of really spoke loudly and helped create hospice and palliative care as we know it today. But a lot of us don't really, work in that world. We're not familiar with hospice. We're not familiar with palliative care. I had no freaking clue, what the specifics were until, I was in home health, where some hospice agencies will contract out to physical therapists for a couple of visits. So the big question that I typically ask, or people that often think about, is what's the difference between hospice and palliative care? So I just went on medlineplus.gov, which is kind of the government's medical information site. And the big difference, so both palliative care and hospice care provide comfort, but palliative care can begin at diagnosis and at the same time as treatment. So hospice care begins after treatment of the disease is stopped and when it is clear that the person is not going to survive the illness. Hospice care is usually offered only when the person is expected to live 6 months or less. Now, I want you to understand that you as a physical therapist can work in those particular situations. It is very challenging, it's very heavy, it's very weighty, but it'll be one of the most rewarding arenas that you can work in. There are hospice agencies that will contract out to home health clinicians, and they'll typically give us a few visits, but those have been some of the most transformative patient interactions that I've had throughout my short career thus far. And so I wanted to share just a few lessons based on those interactions, and just spending time in people's homes that are upper 80s, upper 90s, over 100. Because those are some very precious moments that have informed me, tremendously. So we're just going to kind of go through this list here and just kind of give you some insights gleaned from those experiences. So the first thing, and this was informed by those experiences, but then also by Atul Gawande, and I'm going to mention his book and a few other books at the end of this podcast. But he has said the best way to talk about dying is to talk about living. So Atul Gawande is a physician, but his big critique of the American kind of healthcare system is that it's been so focused on battling death and not prizing life, that we are trying to just push death away, prolong death, push, but we're not necessarily talking about how to really prize and best utilize the life that we do have. And from the physical therapist standpoint, we have to prize life. We have to have those conversations with a lot of our patients of, what do you want to be able to do? What does a good day look like? What are you having trouble with now? And how can we work together to get you to the point where you're able to achieve that specific goal? What we need to talk about the life that is ahead. What do they want out of that life? A lot of times that conversation is not happening, but we as PTs can be having that conversation with our patients, and we can form our plans of care around that to best serve them and help them have a good experience, even all the way towards the end. The second thing that that I've realized and read as well is that the closer that some of our patients get to their deathbed, quote unquote, is that the more their priorities change. So I've had several patients where they had some type of cancer diagnosis that we were still unsure if it was terminal, if it was progressing rapidly. At first, we were working on goals that related around getting back in the garden, walking around the community, getting back to a normal life for them. But then as soon as they got some type of news as their cancer progressed, or things just weren't looking that great, their priorities started to shift a little bit. It went from trying to be able to work on their famous rose bush that the whole neighborhood loves to just being able to get off the toilet, being able to read a book, being able to get out of the chair without having to call someone to help. And if you as a physical therapist aren't attuned to that shift in priorities, you are doing a disservice to your patients. You may be still trying to push your goals or what you think that patient wants, but in reality, their priorities have completely changed. And sometimes the patients won't even tell you that because they'll view it as, they're giving up, which, that's not the case at all. Priorities just change, and we can honor that, but you're not going to be able to honor that if you're not having some type of conversation with your patient. So acknowledge that priorities can change, and it can change in a doctor visit by one sentence that physician would give your patient, maybe about some bad news. So acknowledge that, ask those questions, have your plan of care in an open hand, and know that those goals can shift relatively quickly. The third thing, we need to honor our patient's dignity. So I mentioned this a few times on this podcast, but I know for me, I want to impose what I think the patient can do onto them. So let's say I know that they may be able to do 26-pound goblet kettlebell or a goblet squat with a kettlebell, but they may not want to do that. That may not necessarily correlate to some of their goals that may be completely different from the goals that I may have for that patient. I need to honor the dignity of that person. I mean, we could say it's for all of our patients for sure, but I feel like this is super important with some of our patients that are really grappling with death and dying. Honor their dignity, respect them, respect their choices, and shape our plans of care around that. And then lastly, we need to be talking about this stuff ourselves. We need to be thinking about death, dying. We need to be putting ourselves in the shoes of our patients. I mean, it's a painful thing to think about, me losing my spouse right now, my friends and family passing away, me not being able to do a job that I love and transitioning into this next phase of life. It's painful to think about that. And some of you all listening have gone through some of those transitions. And I know it's not easy, but the more that we think about this, we talk about this, we're going to have a better sense of empathy for our patients to be able to serve them when they're going through some of these tough transitions. It is so easy for us, and I'm mainly talking to a lot of the younger PTs, the fresh PTs, people that have only been out maybe for less than a decade. We're kind of in the prime of life, as some would say. A lot of things are going well. We've got a lot of life to look forward to, that we often push something like death and dying off to the side. We'll think about that when that time comes. But what I would argue is that the sooner that we can really, have some serious conversations, with ourselves, some time to think about death and dying on the front end, the better that will serve us on the back end. That we will be probably healthier in terms of, our ability to accept some of this news, but we'll better be able to serve our patients that are going through some of this stuff. And that's what I think is really important. We need to serve our patients well throughout the whole lifespan, but in particular, when someone, is really grappling with death and dying, we need to take that very seriously and see how we can serve them well. So some would say that, talking about death and dying and talking about some of the issues that are, particularly related to older adults, if you are becoming well-versed in such topics, you are considered an old person in training. So that was termed by Ashton, Applewhite. She wrote the book, This Chair Rocks. But I like to think about that. We're all old people in training, whether physically, by, resistance training, weight training, staying healthy, eating well, all those things. We are preparing ourselves for becoming older adults. But even talking about difficult subjects like this one, death and dying, and you can become an old person in training. So I want to mention a few books. If this topic makes you uncomfortable, if you don't talk about this a lot with some of your patients or even think about it yourself, I want to recommend 3 books, 2 of which I've read, 1 of which I have not read, which you're not supposed to recommend a book that you haven't read, but a lot of really smart people that I respect have said good things, and it's on my reading list. So the first one is this one, When Breath Becomes Air. This is written by, I believe he was a neurosurgery resident, and he had a terminal illness, but he penned the book himself as he was actively dying. And the perspectives from the medical side of things was very interesting, but just the perspective of death and dying as he was kind of wrestling with some of these issues himself was an absolutely fascinating read. The second book, This Chair Rocks, by Ashton Applewhite. She is kind of the pioneer in the fight against ageism. Amazing woman in New York City. I've got to interview her, and she was an amazing person to talk with. But that book is a very entertaining read, but she addresses ageism and a lot of the issues that we talk about with older adults on many different levels. Really entertaining book, relatively easy and quick read, This Chair Rocks. And then last but not least, one that you all are probably most familiar with is Atul Gawande's Being Mortal. I can't say much about the book, but I've listened to any podcast that he's on and any blog posts that he's done, and it's been solid in terms of his perspective. He spent a lot of time with people that are actively, dying, that they, their perspectives, their wishes, all these things. And he's kind of penned a book with a collection of all those thoughts. So, all right, death and dying. I know it's a fun one, but we need to talk about it. So, you all check the Facebook post. I'm going to put links to those different books. And if you want to hop in the next cohort of Modern Management of the Older Adult, June 12th is when we're starting. This course is really taking shape to be something really awesome in terms of how we are basically building on the last week. So it's case-based, and we just keep building and building and building and building to where it's really taking shape to where it's almost like we're telling a story. And at the end, you have a great example of how you can apply a lot of these principles to your older adult patients. So hop in that, ptonice.com, check the link to the books in the Facebook post, and I'll talk to y'all soon.